Well, good evening. This is Bob Graves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor. It's good to be back with you again on a Wednesday evening. Uh, Technical difficulties. We had some speed connection problems, and don't know entirely where. Although I suspect it had to do with the network itself, not necessarily our individual computers. But anyhow, here we are, and a little bit late, but we'll get going right into the stuff that I was hoping to talk about tonight. By the way, I might also add that I want to, on my Sunday evening shows, and initially I'm going to try and do this once a month, but I'd like to do it even more often. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take the Sunday evening show, and I would like to bring on guests who have either been through a particular problem or are trying to um, inquire and look into a potential problem. And that is, I'm looking at people who seem to be in what we might think of as mainline churches, but who are finding that the style of control in those churches is something that they wonder if it's cultic, if there's a problem with it. And I'd like to interview some people and kind of talk to them about the nature of cultic connections and see if I can't, talk them through in a manner of helping them to consider and see things. Now, of course, I don't want to force anybody to do anything they don't want to do. I just want to, improve their ability to think about it, improve their ability to be aware of just what sort of connections that they are forming. There are many organizations that seem to handle relationships very well, but there's some that don't. And unfortunately, the ones that tend to be far more what we think of as biblical are often far more controlling, far more demanding, and maintain a connection that is not necessarily a healthy one. So the show would really focus more on the style of connection, not necessarily looking at a cultic organization in terms of what they teach, as much as we're looking at the way they go about indoctrinating, teaching, or demanding of their congregants or members to conform to the party line, as it were. In fact, this is just a standard problem in all of culture. Every culture has this problem. It's just that every culture usually develops also ways of counteracting it. And what I'm saying is this: we all have a need to belong, and we all have cultures that we belong to that also have a need to kind of sustain the culture. And every culture seeks to exert influence on its members to have them be part of and get included and engaged in what's going on in that culture. But it also allows for the individual to exert a certain amount of balancing independence so that they come to a sense of balance. But in a cult, they deal with all of the things that cause you to need to connect and none of the things that allow you to truly balance the way that connection works. And so we're really looking more for a healthy balance of that sort of thing. So I'd like to be interviewing people on Sunday nights who would be people dealing with this issue or who have already dealt with the issue and want to talk about it so that we can educate ourselves and become more informed about how this actually works and what people do in order to break away from that sort of cultic control. Because after all, you can't go from being deeply connected with a bunch of people to just having nothing to do with anybody. It doesn't work that way. And we can't cop out of all culture and society. What we need to do is we need to find that balance between being a part of other people, being connected to other people, but still maintaining an appropriate sense of personal boundary and taking responsibility for that and not surrendering that power or that responsibility to anyone. Now, tonight I want to talk about some of the things that deal with the way that we develop as people in a way that I felt that more of the mainstream experience that I had when I was involved in ministry that can sometimes get in the way, and particularly the way that traditional faith is often uh, tries to come to us in a way where it is so interested in protecting the tradition that it does not concern itself or worry itself in any manner about what this might actually do to you personally. And I found that I got to a certain point in my own life where I realized that certain aspects of my own personal development and personal maturity were just not happening. And I can remember it was somewhere around 1980 when I discovered this book by Carl Rogers, On Becoming a Person. And I remember looking at the book and thinking to myself, I have no clue. What does it mean that I am a person? I had given myself over so much to this faith. I had given myself over so much to being a person who identified himself with Christ that I really had precious little concept of some way what it really means to be me, to be a person. And I found the book to be at first, kind of unusual and odd. And although Carl Rogers is somebody who has a very gentle and easygoing approach, one I don't necessarily subscribe to. Not that I'm interested in being, rough and egregious, but um, nonetheless, his concept of the developing and emerging person and his faith in the human being to be able to do such a thing was something that I found kind of foreign to the message and the culture that I was a part of while being a fundamentalist. And that was a strange thing to realize that. I mean, because this is something that up until then I had really been just focusing on doing what I was doing. And although I was at that time well involved in things that were allowing that fundamentalism to change and making sure that I would abandon it, I hadn't really replaced it with much of anything of substance or consideration. You know, I noticed that in looking at myself and looking at others, I found I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only person walking around kind of damaged, kind of underdeveloped, arrested in my development. One of the things that I found that was very, very common is that although I found that in secular society, if we could talk that way, by the way, that's one of those lines that I think Jim Palmer is so good about talking that we should be erasing that line, the difference between secular and sacred. It's in some ways a very artificial line because, we are who we are and we have a life that involves a variety of axes and interests and concerns and responsibilities. And it's not as if we have this compartmentalization going on. But anyhow, I noticed that as I looked around at people of faith and to myself and compared that with people who were not people of faith, well, one of the things that I noticed right away is that people of faith tend to be far more hung up about sexuality. They're just focused on it. Usually in either in struggling with it or in this necessity to be really good and pure. And I was involved with an organization that was reaching out to people who had struggled with some of these issues. And I had come to the conclusion, and say, what year would that have been? I'm trying to think. I think that it was I was still a fundamentalist, but I had become, quite a stick in the eye for other fundamentalists because I was already quite different. I still accepted the authority of Scripture and stuff like that in the same way, but I just saw it very differently. I'm trying to think, but anyhow, so it was somewhere around the 80s where I was involved with this ministry where we reached out to people who were struggling with the issue of obsessive behaviors, which also included sexual obsessions with pornography or things like that, and our attitude was that love, not just a good feeling, not just happy niceness, but a genuine, real awareness of the preciousness of being um, who we are, and the preciousness of people. That I was more along the lines of believing that this was the answer and not sin management and things like that. And I found that when you talked to Christians, they didn't like that message. They often didn't couldn't deal with it. If you gave them the bland message or just the general form, they would totally agree with you. But once you started getting specific, then they, oh, no, 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 no. They really had this need to somehow really turn to some obsessive sin management program. And they often were people who didn't like their bodies. Not that they're the only people who feel that way, but people who also, they just had a sense of the human being as a dirty, filthy thing. And that this problem that we have with the focus on sex is just a real bad thing, and that struck me as being something that I was coming to believe was not only incorrect, but extremely counterproductive to the point of actually creating many of the problems they were struggling with. Of course, they would have to struggle with these problems. When you have that core belief about your essence and yourself, and part of who and what you are as a human being is a sexual being, when you're seeing your core self as incorporating that kind of a feature, I'm sorry, you're going to create problems just by having that kind of an attitude about yourself and others. I also was, at that time becoming aware of the fact that people of faith, not just in terms of faith, but in terms of almost everything, at least the group of people I was hanging with. Maybe I'm telling you more about me and my people. But there was this overly simplistic black and white thinking that was a part of it all. And, things were either this or that. And there was all this certainty just up the wazoo. And they were not at all comfortable or even aware of the possibility of having things that they didn't know or weren't sure of, or maybe it's this, maybe it's that, and or even a sense of comfort with conundrum. No comfort with it. A lot of compulsive praying and going to crusades and a need to quote scripture and a lot of other ritualistic type behaviors that began to strike me as not having any real connection with being. And of course, this is why I was so ready for it when I found that book by Carl Rogers to read it. There was a lot of magical thinking, so that there was this there was I would call it a magical thinking that was kind of a duality that they were in denial of. On one hand, they believed that everything was going to hell in a handbasket, and on the other hand, they believed that God was somehow magically going to make everything okay, which caused them to be both pessimistic and hopeful that it will all work out, all while remaining passive and doing nothing about anything. That struck me as, this is a recipe for disaster. This is not going to work out well. And sure enough, I found that, in the 80s, how old was I? I was, approaching 30. And some of the people that I'd known as Christians since I was 20, including myself, we're still struggling with the same issues we were struggling with a decade ago. Oh, we had more stories. Oh, we had more ideas. Oh, we had more notions. Oh, we had more Bible verses. But we didn't have any progress. That wasn't really there. And in my honesty, I had to face that issue. And I saw my faith as being something that was a factor in it. Because although everybody has to grow up, nobody's born already mature and already well-adjusted in every way. We all go through a process of facing various challenges in life and dealing with them well or not, and then having to move on to the next phase, carrying with it the baggage we might be bringing with us. We all go through that. But I noticed that oftentimes people of faith seem to be carrying a lot more baggage and living in denial that they had it. They tried to live as if always smiling, And Jesus has made my life wonderful. And everything is great. And I am so happy now that I belong to Jesus. Everything is wonderful. And you look at their lives, and they are in worse condition than anybody else's. It was about that same time that I had also obtained a degree with a focus in accounting in computer science and computer programming. And I had the opportunity to work on the books of a variety of different companies, small businesses, most of them, not all of them. But there were some of these business, there was about 15 businesses that I had become familiar with enough that I personally had access to almost all of their books. And the one thing that I noticed, and I never really, I didn't share any details with anybody. You got to be confidential with this stuff. But one of the things that I did notice was this: the books of the companies run by Christians were in terrible condition. Their profit margins were just squeaking by. Some of the decisions they were making as a result of having prayed about it indicated to me they had no concept of cash flow, of debt management, of making sure that they had a business plan to deal with areas of the business, keeping aware of things where they're the losing money, where they're gaining money, how different departments and phases of the business that they're dealing with are dealing with costs and labor, and how that contributes to the way they decide to charge for their goods and services. I found them to be unaware of these things, unconcerned about them, and that when they looked at the issues and problems they were having and knew they were kind of going through some financial squeezes, they prayed about it instead of learning about business. And there was one business, however, that was an exception. It was a rather large company, and the man who was in charge of it and owned it was a Christian man, and he had hired me also as a consultant to come in and make sure that their computer system was set up to handle their books. And as I'm talking to him, he was a very very honest guy on many levels, and I liked him a lot. And one of the things he confessed to me, and in shame, he said, I'm really not that good of a Christian businessman. I got to be honest with you. I pray about my decisions, but I don't really get any answers. And I find that I have to make my decisions based upon, the science of the day and the things that I learned in college and, what I learned in marketing and in business decisions. And I admire these other people. And he was even mentioning some of the people he knew I'd worked on their books. And I can't tell him, oh, look, their books are in bad shape. I couldn't say that. That would not be appropriate. But he's confessing to me how he felt somewhat inferior to some of these other people because he's not really managing his business like a real Christian. He was managing it more with a secular approach. And you know what? His books were in immaculate condition. and I said, no, I think you're doing fine, and I tried to encourage him to realize that, if this is what's working for you and God seems to be silent about these issues, evidently, you're okay, you're good. So just continue with this. And he did, I guess. But I that was something that as I observed that, it made me open my eyes, raise my eyebrows, and realize I had to take a close look at this dynamic. Why could these people be making such terrible business decisions? And you couldn't tell them they were making terrible business decisions. There was one company that had hired me to come in and assess. They'd heard me talking about different ideas, and they thought, oh, great, this would be wonderful. He's like a motivational guy. And so they brought me in, and I looked at the things that were going on in that company, and I ended up making a number of recommendations based on the things they asked me to look at. I talked to some of their clients, I talked to some of their vendors, I saw what they were doing, and I finally gave them a list of recommendations. And as I talked to them about those recommendations, they shot every single one down. No, we can't. We don't want to do that. Well, no. I mean that could be a good idea, but we're not going to do that. And every single idea they knocked down. And I realized that, well, we're not going to be able to do what they hired me to do. And so, although they had hired me to come on the company full time, I gave them a notice that I would be leaving because I just didn't see a future in it. And I was about before my last day. Somebody else in the company is large enough that they hired me actually to do a different job. And I wasn't finding anything else at the time, so I took it. And while I was there with other responsibilities, I came across in one of the desks a discovery that they had actually spoken to other consultants. And I found a list of 52 recommendations. Every recommendation that I had made was on that list. And so they'd seen this list before and they turned them down then. And part of the reason was they were praying about it, and this struck me as the way I concluded was that somehow these ideas were outside of their comfort zone, and they somehow built their faith up in a way where their faith was teaching them to imagine that God is telling them things that were really a reflection of deep down inside their own comfort level or their own discomfort level. And this made me very suspicious that this concept of praying for business decisions is not really a good business practice. It wasn't going to work. And as much as I would like to defend the idea that God will help you with everything and anything, I had to be honest, it wasn't working, and the people trying to put it into practice were not making the kind of progress that they needed to. And it struck me as actually even irresponsible in that this one company had several dozen employees and was struggling with some of these cash issues and might have to let several of these people go. And to think that they are taking on the responsibility of being an employer, and they have people who are counting on them for a job when there's work actually to be done, but because of mismanagement, these people could end up without a job. And it just struck me as being inappropriate, unwise, and foolish. And so I'm making these observations about these trends that seem to be going on with people of faith. And it forced me to really think things through. And, I began to see that they had this magical thinking and a duality that God is going to fix everything and it's going to be just fine, but everything is terrible because Satan is against us and all this. And they never really put the two together while they remained passively waiting for God to just move them in various ways. I noticed, that they would tend to manipulate scripture and quote things to try to justify their decisions. But I noticed also that they would sometimes experience some of these breakdowns in relationships, and I was as well. That when you're overly religious, as it were, you become a pain in the neck to people who aren't religious in ways you may not realize. You end to they get a little bit tired of your rigid obsession to rules, rituals, or guidelines that you may not even realize you're doing. You may think, I'm having a relationship with Jesus, and you don't realize that you're really letting it get in the way of a normal life and getting in the way of your other relationships as you walk around every day in a trance-like state and a glazed, happy face, and filled with very uncompromising, judgmental attitudes. Well, anyway, looking at all these observations, I realized that in my own life, that although I'm making these observations, I had to be honest that it wasn't really that different for me either. My own faith had kind of hindered me, been a barrier to my own personal development. I had a past that also required me to be dealing with a great deal of damage that I had hoped my faith would have cured. But I had to be honest, it was not healing the problems. And one of the big issues that I found that I had was a problem in understanding human emotion. And eventually this actually led me to a desire to actually go back to school. I went back to school another time. This time I I went and I got a degree in human development. And I studied in a secular school, in a secular setting. I studied. Uh, I took a curriculum that looked at anthropology, sociology, psychology, and politics, and a variety of other humanities as a way of trying to appreciate how each of these lenses looks at human problems in a different way, from a different standpoint, and how each of these brings strengths and weaknesses to the human problem. And this was a marvelous opportunity. I loved it. I enjoyed it, and ended up graduating with that degree, and it really taught me a lot. But while I was there, one of the big focuses that I had was studying human emotion. In addition to my schoolwork, one of the things that I did was I would go to the library, and every week I disciplined myself to read at least two journal articles on research into human emotion, both from a standpoint of sociology and from psychology. And I made sure that I would read these and try to become familiar with a lot of the things going on in the field of studying human emotion. And of course, it is amazing the amazing amount of research just going on in that area, and how much more we know about dealing with these sorts of things. But as I did, one of the things I did notice, that even in the secular world, that we live in a day where academically we tend to specialize. And as a result, most people who are scholars are a little reluctant to speak outside of their field. And I can appreciate that and understand that. If they study a particular, like one of the fellows that I was reading up on, studied emotions in the face and the facial expressions. And his books were just extremely informative about how the connection and what's going on and the observations he'd made in various cultures and throughout the world. But that's all he would speak to. And when it came to other issues of emotion, he just didn't have much to say. I noticed nobody was willing to allow for a comprehensive general overview of human emotion that could then be put together in a way that the average person could benefit from the state of the art of the things we now know about human emotion. And rather, there's all these people studying these other areas and just only talking about those areas. So I wanted to see if I could put something together, and realize there's a lot of holes, and so there'd be some more theory in it than I wanted. But anyhow, I came to a point where I developed a very, what was for me, clear understanding of my own emotion and the emotions I saw in other people. And here's where it brought me. And this was something that I think I would have seen and observed and understood years earlier if it hadn't been for the way my own obsessive faith got in the way, and also the fact that I'm coming from a very somewhat damaged background, that I had hoped that my faith would have healed and taken care of. By the way, before I mention specifically the theories that I developed there, I would want to say this: that one of the things that I noticed in looking at, either whether it was accounting or the way these people manage their relationships, I found that people of faith, if they tended to be people who were generally wise, they had a sense of a very wise Jesus leading them. And the people who tended to be very immature or very unwise or very foolish or very uneducated, it seemed to me that when they thought they were following what God was leading them to do, that their Jesus was just as stupid as they were. And this led me to finally conclude that none of these people are really being led about by Jesus. They're being led about by themselves in a way they think is Jesus, which helps to explain why Jesus is always just as smart or just as stupid as they are, just as wise, just as foolish as they are. And they just found a way of finding that internal coherence within them and thinking that's the Holy Spirit. At least that's the conclusion I came to. And so I found myself developing some serious doubts, not in everything that has to do with faith and not in everything that has to do with a sense of the presence of God, but with all of these specifics that people were dealing with, using their faith as a substitute for responsible living. I came to believe that the faith had actually gotten in the way for them and for me. Anyhow, So it brought me to this point where I finally was very happy to arrive at. And I discovered something about human emotion. And I'm going to share with you four principles of human emotion that I think that I was finally able to get a hold of, that my traditional faith was, for at least me, making it difficult to really make this observation and come to this understanding much sooner. The first thing that I noticed is that, first of all emotions are totally involuntary, completely involuntary. There is not a single human emotion you're capable of having that you can choose to have or choose to not have, no matter what that emotion is. And that then told me philosophically that all emotions are in and of themselves amoral. They're neither right nor wrong. They are what they are. Now, this doesn't mean that that everything's okay and just feel whatever you feel like and roll with it. We got a comment here. Let's see what we got here. A viewer comment. If Jesus is within us, why do so many seek him from without? And if he has given us his spirit, why does the church teach us not to trust our own hearts? Well, it's an interesting question, and you might not like my answer. I do believe that Christ is within us, that this is the hope of glory. And I do believe that it is the indwelling Christ that is the empowering energy of our transformation. But I also believe that this is very inarticulate. You don't know what's really going on, and you may never know that. And you don't need to know this. Do you need to know what your blood cells are doing as they work through your liver and your kidney to clean your bloodstream of the various waste products that your body is producing? Do you need to understand this in order for your kidneys and liver to function? No. They do what they do because that's what they do, and that they're good at it. And the indwelling Christ is in various ways emerging. Christ is coming out of you from inside. There's this growth that you're coming in. How does this growth happen? I don't think we even know. I'm not worried about it, but I do know this. Every time we think we can nail it down as a theory, we're probably coming up with something that isn't really true, and we're now structuring ourselves so that we can't work outside of that. I think it's a mystery. Christ in you. It's a mystery, the hope of glory. I don't know what he's doing there, but I suspect that more than anything else, he's loving you. He's living there. He's enjoying you. The company is for him just awesome to keep, and he's close by. That's a very encouraging thing. It's a very comfortable thing for him, and I think we can allow that to become a very comfortable thing for us. There's a sense in which we work out our problems without getting hints from God as to how to deal with it, while he stands by with us, looking at us with that very pleased eye, thinking, you got it. You're doing good. You're going to get it. I'm sure of it. No. I'm not going to say nothing. You're just doing fine. Have I told you today that you're just wonderful and I love you? This is more the role, and where Jesus is there, and he comes out in ways where it's not necessarily the kind of thing where you say, "Oh, there he is," that's him right there, and it's just a growing sort of thing. But then, why is it that the church teaches us to trust our own hearts? I would say that part of the reason is this. They develop these theories as to what Jesus is really doing and what he's supposed to do, and these theories are false. And when they see that not happening in you, and they see you entertaining ideas, they want you to not be doing that. So they try to make it rigid and take control of it. And here they want to take control of internal processes going on inside of you. I got news for you. You can't control those internal processes going on inside of you, and you don't need to. You don't need to. So, to me, it was just great interference in our normal health and development. So anyway, back to where I was at, that not only did I discover that emotions are completely involuntary, I did find that they are not necessarily random, that there were four things going on inside of you that determine completely what it is you will feel at any given moment in time. The first thing is, um, and these aren't in any particular order, they all work together as part of your emotional apparatus, your focus. There are things you're paying attention to. There are things you're not paying attention to. You have a history of paying attention to certain things. People who are critical, they take a look at something and they notice everything wrong. They don't notice the things that are right, and that's what they focus on. And of course, they're miserable and they're angry and there's things they don't like. And it's not surprising that their attitude and emotional personality is what it is because of their focus. But anyhow, the focus that we take is something that becomes for us a habit. We do what we've learned to do, what we think is safe, what we believe is going to work. And we're not necessarily interested in a focus that is genuinely honest, that allows ourselves to be generally aware of all things in a balanced and representative way. But the more we can alter our focus to allow ourselves to be more aware of the general range of things going on around us and to pay attention to them and to be open to allowing the habits and the fixed feelings and habits that we have of observing certain things, we can change our focus. And your emotions will always be a reflection of whatever it is that's in your focus, even if it's in the periphery. If it's in your focus, you will be having feelings about it. The other thing that is also true is this. You not only have a focus, you have a perspective. That is, everything within your focus is something that you have some sort of history with. And in that history, you have come to the conclusion that this thing means this, that this thing is true, that this is not true, that this thing doesn't mean that. And as a result, you've kind of figured it out inside of your own brain what all of these things mean. And you're not necessarily correct. Now, it's important that we all realize that you can't function without assigning meaning to things, but let's not take it too seriously to think that the meaning that we've assigned to everything is indeed an accurate one or an honest one. The odd thing is that you today are more mature than you've ever been, and everything you are relying on in your history is something that you observed when you were a less mature person than you are today. That makes it highly suspect. We need to be able to have a different perspective. We need to be able to entertain ways that are outside of the box we've been in. But I guarantee you that when something takes your focus, that your history with those things that are within your focus are going to be very commanding and controlling in how it is you feel. If you're angry and miserable, it is because there are things within your focus somewhere for which it makes sense to you that being angry about that is the proper way to feel about it. Whereas if you had a different perspective about things, if you had a different focus, if you were noticing other features, you would have a more balanced way of looking at things. You'd also discover that the best way to manage your emotions is to not try to stuff the ones you think are wrong or try to gain the ones that are correct, but rather to engage your focus in a proper way, to engage your perspective in a proper way. There's two more principles that I want to mention, but before I do, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Sometimes this surprises people. I talk about the joy of being offended. Am I ever offended? Sure. Does it upset me when I'm offended? Not at all. It is a privilege to be offended. Every time I'm offended, I'm aware of the fact that I have values. Now, the values that I have are values I'm comfortable with. Sometimes I'm offended and I realize that I'm offended because of some values that I have. But as I take a look at those values, I realize, that's not really all that valuable. I'm open to having a different focus. I'm open to having a different perspective. And by being offended, I'm becoming aware of the fact that something that I value is somehow perceived by me as being not appropriately appreciated. Well, wonderful. If I discover that, I do appreciate this thing and I do value this, then it's my privilege to be offended. You can't have values without experiencing the upside and the downside of when the things you value are being treated well or being mistreated, or if you perceive them to be treated badly or well. So it's all part of the deal. And so it's just an opportunity for us to be honest with ourselves as to where our values really are. And I'm going to get back to that in just a moment. Let me mention the other two things. Your general state of health creates the context of your body chemistry, as it were. And for each of us, this can be a little bit different. And so there is going to be certain ways that we can feel that are going to be more natural for some of us. That doesn't mean that we're stuck there. But our general state of health does have some restrictions that it places on the way we're going to feel about anything. You know, when you're miserable and sick and you've been under the weather for a long time, it's not easy to be happy about everything because you don't feel so good. You know, and so your physical health does have a constraint on that, and your history of things that you've experienced in the past will also have some sort of a stricture upon you. So it's important that you be a person who's willing to rethink the way that you understand the world. It's important that you keep yourself in good health. It's important that you develop a wider variety of ways of making sense of things and not necessarily settling into any of them with such fervor and obsession and dogma. It's also important that you realize that your focus is something that you're using many times just as a way of coping. This is not necessarily a good thing. And so, therefore, it is through these dynamics going on inside of you. These are the things that precipitate the feelings that you're having. So this means that your feelings are not only amoral, but your feelings are always a reflection, never of reality, but of what you're doing with reality. Nobody ever makes you feel the way you feel. Nothing ever makes you feel the way you feel. You make you feel the way that you feel because this is your context, this is your body, this is your focus, this is your perspective, this is your general state of health. You have an aptitude and a capacity to see things, that things that are beyond your ability to understand are things that are never going to be within your focus and never going to be within your perspective. And so you need to accept these limits. But think about it, no matter what you're feeling right now, if I was skilled enough to talk to you about what are you paying attention to, even in the periphery? What do you believe to be true about those things that you're focused on? What's your current state of health? You know, and if we were to take a look at your aptitude and your capacity for insight and understanding, if I could look at those four things, the way you feel right now would make complete sense. Because what you feel is a reflection, not of the reality that you're dealing with. What you're feeling, your emotions are right now a reflection of your focus. They are a reflection of your perspective. They are a reflection of your capacity to understand reality based on your aptitude, and it's also a reflection of your current state of health. Those are the things that determine exactly what you're going to feel right now. The issues that you're dealing with are merely the context in which this occurs. This is why different people can be in similar contexts and experience it totally different. They have a different perspective, a different focus, a different history, a different capacity to appreciate, and maybe a different state of health. This means that whatever you feel, it's an opportunity to be honest about you. It's your problem, and it's not even really a problem. It's just the end result of all of this. That is something that took me a long time to figure out. And I was hindered in finding it out because of the way my faith got in the way and my magic Jesus, you know. Anyhow, that's pretty much all I wanted to share with you tonight and talk to you about how my own development of faith kind of allowed me to go down this other way of understanding myself and particularly coming to a reconciliation with my own emotional self. I hope that has been helpful to you. And I'll see you on Sunday. This is Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. See you then. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for Dr. Michael W. Jones coming up in just a few minutes.